Oh my god, people! Apple is not ditching Face ID. How desperate news cycles get these days when they find any slight chance of some powerful headline. It shocks me. So today we're debunking a lot of people that are going on the internet right now and suggesting that Apple is removing Face ID or perhaps even making a China-specific iPhone that has Touch ID underneath the display. There's a lot to unpack, so let's just begin. So the funniest example of over-the-top clickbait headlines has to be Forbes, or as I like to call them, 4Bs, because you could likely say 4 insects could have more insight. They literally start the headline off with, "There are multiple rumors that Apple is ditching Face ID." No, there isn't. In fact, the very link that you posted in that article takes you to a site that says Apple is considering making one China-focused smartphone that doesn't have Face ID with a Touch ID sensor built underneath the display to save on cost, to make a cheaper iPhone model. What? First of all, I think the Galaxy S10 should be the example that adding a fingerprint reader underneath the display is not necessarily a cheaper way to go around biometrics. Sure, Face ID is expensive, I will give you that, but you cannot make the argument that an ultrasonic fingerprint reader, which we know Apple would likely go forward with, they're not gonna go all cheap like the OnePlus 6T does, is not a particularly cheap method of manufacturing. Also, if Apple history has taught us anything, it's that changing designs or designing new types of smartphones that have to look and have software written different for them, those are the most expensive ones to manufacture. That's why you don't see Apple coming out with those radical iPhone SE2 designs everyone wanted. That's why you don't see budget phones coming from Apple that drastically look different than previous generation iPhones. Whenever Apple wants to make an affordable iPhone, they just take the previous year's flagship and lower the price. Is it because magically the manufacturing of the iPhone 8 has suddenly become cheaper? Well, maybe, but that's not all of it. It's mostly because the iPhone 8 is no longer their flagship seller. They have new phones like the XS, the XR, and XS Max. For their primary flagships, that's where they get most of their profit because those phones have a higher profit margin. They know the iPhone 8 is not going to be selling as well because it is older, so they're okay with lowering the price point on it because they can accept a smaller profit margin on those older phones. They know those older phones aren't going to sell as well as the newer phones, so they keep on manufacturing them and they sell them at a lower price. The ridiculousness of the article that I know people were referring to earlier, I saw it and immediately debunked it because it made no sense for Apple to completely design a brand new iPhone line separate from the XR and the XS and whatever else is coming out this year just for China. For one, they're not known for doing that. If they do a country-specific model, it's always something very, very small, like the dual SIM option for Chinese mobile carriers, but that is still a XS, it's still a XR. If Apple was to make a China-specific iPhone that removed Face ID in favor of Touch ID underneath the display, we're talking a massive different manufacturing process in production, changing up that process in rearranging assembly lines. That costs a lot of money. Also, you have to design the software to behave differently for this phone now that Face ID for both Apple Pay or Animoji support or biometrics when unlocking different apps and having to go back to Touch ID, building it underneath the display. They have to write all the new lines of code for the graphics to be different, the unlocking mechanisms have to be different, the access to Apple Pay has to be different. It would take so much more time for Apple to send all of their software engineers to redesign iOS so that, for one, it could adopt Touch ID underneath the display, and also, two, have to design apps and widgets differently on the iPhone because that notch, I assume, would no longer really need to be there. You would have to shrink that notch down to just a single camera, and you really think that they're going to let the Chinese market have the smaller notch and more screen-to-body ratio with Touch ID underneath the display? They would really give that to China, but then the rest of the world, they'd be like, nah, y'all have to put up with Face ID, the rest of you don't get Touch ID. This article, which was not reported on by multiple people, I think more people should be aware, it was mentioned by the Global Times, which really doesn't have like a super concrete track record of predicting leaks and rumors in advance. You know, if it was Mark Gurman saying this, or if it was Benjamin Mayo, or if it was Ming-Chi Kuo that was reporting on an upcoming iPhone just for China with a smaller notch and fingerprint reader underneath the display, then we would have a different discussion, but it was literally just one article that was not backed up by any credible leakers. It was not backed up by OnLeaks. It was not backed up by Ben Geskin. Literally just one article, and then Forbes had the gumption to go ahead and say, so there's plenty of rumors going around that they're ditching Face ID, right? You could not be more exaggerated and over the top with the headline. Also, even if this phone is real, let's say the Global Times, they don't have a proven track record, but they actually end up to be 100% right with this one. They're just an untapped leaker that we haven't heard from yet. Even if that's true, it doesn't mean Apple's ditching Face ID. It means that they would be designing one specific iPhone model for China only that happens to not have Face ID, because switching to an ultrasonic fingerprint reader somehow saves you money. If you guys recall, switching from the Galaxy S9 to the Galaxy S10, there was a price jump there. The phones overall got more expensive because fingerprint readers underneath the display are not a super cheap way to go. Leaving out the Face ID sensor could save some money, but if your alternative is fingerprint reader underneath the display, then no, the price point is so incredibly close. If anything, under the display fingerprint reader, and also having to buy all new displays for these next generation iPhones that would have to adopt to a new notch size, change the assembly process, change the manufacturing process, would be far too much money, far too much effort just for the Chinese market. Even if it is a very, very large market that Apple wants to compete in, if you want to sell phones really, really well over there, it's not a matter of just lowering the iPhone XR from $750 to $600. That wouldn't do it, because the majority of Huawei phones that sell in China, we're not talking just a little bit cheaper than the XR. We're talking fractions of the price. We're talking $200, $300 phones that sell really, really well there, because the people who live in that country don't have as much money to burn on smartphones like other countries do. And now that the Huawei ban has been lifted and Huawei's allowed to work with Android and Google services again, it would make no sense that Apple would go through such lengthy efforts just to save a little bit of money on the next iPhone. And I find it ridiculous that people took that out of context. One report about one possible iPhone that had no evidence, no credible leakers or anyone backing it up, and went, so Apple's ditching Face ID, right? Oh my gosh, guys, can you just use like a smidge, just a pinch, just grab that little pinch of logic and just sprinkle it on your news cycle, okay? Just be like, wait a minute, that wouldn't make sense. If there is a possibility of Apple adopting the fingerprint reader underneath the display, it's likely coming to the flagship iPhones with OLED displays and have Face ID already, and it will be considered an extra biometric option. But if you were to ask me what I think Apple's doing, I think they're done with Touch ID. I think they would much rather just have one biometric that gets better and better over time. Hopefully they'll be improving Face ID this year with the iPhone 11, making it work from further away and more angles, like they made it work on the iPad Pro from so many more angles. And it sounds far much more like the Apple thing to do, in my opinion, to just kind of go all in on one biometric instead of trying to make a device that has two and then the user gets to decide which one they want. Have you guys seen how much Apple pushes Animoji? How often they talk about the face tracking and augmented reality features that is possible thanks to the dot projector and the Face ID sensors that are capable in the notch? It doesn't make sense to me that they would go through all this effort. They would need new displays, guys. They couldn't use the displays they're already using because that notch would be a smaller footprint. So they would have to manufacture all new displays, change the software, change the assembly process, all just for a slightly cheaper iPhone. And if it's an ultrasonic fingerprint reader, there's no way you'd be saving that much money on it. We're talking maybe like $750 starting price down to $700 at maximum, probably even less than that. If you really wanted to make an iPhone just for China and you just wanted to make it affordable and cheap, they would probably put the fingerprint reader on the back, if anything. And still at that point, you would have to buy new displays. So even that wouldn't make too much sense. I would probably suggest Apple just take the hit on the iPhone sales in China as they already have, just lowering the profit margin for that specific market and just sell the XR and XS for way cheaper in that country than any other country. It probably won't help because the majority of your competition there is buying $200, $300 Huawei phones, which Huawei even takes the hit on in that country. So yeah, it's gonna be pretty impossible for them to compete there with the type of iPhones Apple makes, and don't expect a iPhone without Face ID in favor of the ultrasonic fingerprint reader for a long time, if ever. Let me know if you guys think I'm wrong or if there's some major point that I'm somehow missing by hitting me up over on Twitter or joining our Discord. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.